In the oppressive heat of July 1895, White County, Arkansas, was alive with routines that soothed and suffocated its farming families in equal measure. Broad cotton fields stretched out beneath a relentless sun, their furrows dusty and deep, as if the land itself was perpetually bracing for secrets that might one day surface. At the outskirts of these swaying rows, a building sat in silence, the Blood Mill. It was old, older than most could recall, and its name was spoken only in private, usually at night when the darkness pressed against window panes and creaked through the warped floorboards of modest rural homes. The mill had arrived before memory settled, a vanguard of industry promising prosperity and progress, but leaving only dread in its wake. Its broad frame hunched over the landscape, half consuming the sky, and some said the air around it was thicker, less welcoming. Children hurried past its derelict foundation on their way to school, clutching each other's hands and refusing to make eye contact with its broken doors. Adults, too pragmatic to admit their own unease, told tales of spectral groans and unexplained lights only when the wind howled too fiercely for comfort. Every generation in White County grew up knowing, instinctively, there were places best left undisturbed. The Blood Mill was the heart of that understanding. Its legend traveled in whispers, from the market stalls on Main Street to the porch steps, where the old folks rocked long into the evening. It was always the same message: after dark, keep your distance. The mill remembers. The words weren't just superstition. They had the sharp, practical edge of lived experience, the kind that parents impart in the hope that their children will not repeat long-standing mistakes. Most days, the mill seemed to sleep, windows clouded with grime, machinery frozen in rust, a slanting roof draped with moss, as if the earth itself was trying to reclaim what had been built without permission. But after sunset, the sense of slumber changed. The air would suddenly still, and even the most skeptical souls paused when a dog barked at nothing, or when the frogs went silent by the creek. Arkansas's daylight never lasted long enough in midsummer, and for all its brightness, it could not fully erase the mill's persistent gloom. Those who lived closest, families whose properties bordered the woods behind the mill, were most attuned to its rhythms. They heard things. Sometimes it was only the wind threading through half-shattered window frames, but sometimes it was not. There were nights when thin voices seemed to drift from within, unhurried but deeply mournful. The sound mingled with childhood nightmares, and the stories grandparents hadn't quite explained. One such evening, Annie Harper, age 9, watched the sun slide behind the trees, painting the sky orange and purple. The light touched the mill briefly before fading to black. Annie's father, Samuel, crossed the yard and shut the window quietly, locking it, then drew the curtain. "No more staring, Annie," he said gently, the words familiar and resolute. "Darkness stirs things in the old places." Annie nodded, pulling her quilt up to her chin. She had seen the mill in dreams, sometimes monstrous, sometimes merely sad, forever alone. Inside the Harper home, the day wound to a close, dinner time, then chores, then voices winding down into quiet. But outside, the mill dominated everything. Sometimes, neighbors saw lantern light flicker inside, only to vanish. Sometimes, ruts appeared overnight in the earth out back, as if something dragged heavy across the ground. Eventually, curiosity grew into dread, inspiring nothing but silence as everyone turned in for the night. Not everyone ignored the unease. Older boys dared each other to run up and slap the wall after sundown. Most came back laughing, breathless, but some didn't laugh at all, faces pale and eyes wide, refusing to say what they'd witnessed. Those boys kept their secrets and watched the mill with a wary respect. In school, rumor spread as quickly as chalk dust, each version worse than the last. The mill was haunted. The mill devoured stray animals. The mill called to weak-willed wanderers who'd never return. In reality, what happened inside after dark was far simpler and much worse. The Blood Mill stood as a monument not just to Arkansas's history, but its buried pain. In its prime, the building had processed more than wheat, maize, and cotton. It had been a place of lonely men, desperate debts, and deals done in the shadows. Sometimes a worker vanished. Sometimes an entire family left without warning, possessions packed hurriedly. eyes fixed on the horizon. Georgia Martin, eldest daughter of one such family, still remembered the day her father locked their doors and whispered, "It's time to go." When she asked why, he answered without meeting her gaze, "Some debts are too heavy for us here." The family fled to Tennessee, but the memory of the mill clung to Georgia, a shadow she never escaped. She would later write, "Nothing hurt more than seeing how fear could hollow out a man's heart." Back in White County, daily life remained punctuated by reminders. The local pastor included prayers for protection from the old, the wicked, and the waiting. The sheriff made a habit of patrolling the surrounding woods with his lantern, his steps uncertain in the deepening shadows. And every so often, a stranger passing through would pause, glance at the abandoned site, and walk a little quicker, caught by the same disquiet that haunted the residents. Whispers persisted of dark stains found in the earth, and of bone fragments unearthed where the mill's loading dock had once stood. Some men swore the river ran red after hard rain, flooding the fields with blood-tinged water that evaporated before morning. No one investigated openly. To do so would admit the fear, and in White County, survival depended on turning worry into ritual. The blood mill remained, silent yet living, its secrets buried but never forgotten. The town endured by pretending that all misfortunes were the will of God, not the result of generations spent entwined with the shadow of a building that refused to rot and collapse. Only the bravest or the most desperate ever stepped past its warped doors under starless skies. Night deepened and the land fell still. The mill watched as always, unblinking, unyielding, awaiting those unlucky enough or foolish enough to seek answers within. The echoes it kept were not easily silenced. They moved through the families of White County, down through bloodlines and broken promises, carving invisible scars no sunlight could ever heal. As dawn neared, the world seemed poised on a threshold, caught between the comfort of routine and the ancient terrors hiding inside those shadowed walls. The mill's story was only beginning, but already its power shaped every decision, every dream, every fear that traveled the Arkansas wind. And so, as dawn painted the horizon, a new day began in White County, but the secret war between routine and terror lingered. The blood mill held its silence, and all who lived within sight of its broken frame knew the rules. After dark, keep your distance. The building remembers. Morning in White County offered only temporary comfort. As sunlight crept across fields rimmed by wild columbines and tall pines, most families set aside their fears, if only for a few hours. Yet in every gesture lingered a nervous tension. A mother hesitating before letting her son fetch water from the creek that edged the mill's shadow. A farmer's glance lingering over his shoulder when chopping would before dawn. No one admitted aloud that the ghost of the past night's unease trailed their every step, but it was there, silent and patient, waiting. The town of Bradford, not far from the blood mill, stood as the heart of White County's daily life. Its single main street, lined with clapboard shops and a church with a whitewashed steeple, bustled with purposeful movement as the townsfolk tried to mark their world with normalcy. Yet there was no hiding the subtle changes wrought by the mill's legend. Children played in groups, never straying too far from the sight lines of parents. The doors of the sheriff's office creaked open more often than in neighboring towns, stray dogs, missing poultry, and rumors of strangers skulking near the old stone bridge always seemed to wind back to that looming edifice beyond the trees. At the general store, where barrels of flour and salt stood in neat ranks along the walls, stories traveled as swiftly as the wind. Mr. Haggerty, the storekeeper with hands calloused from years of lifting crates, tried to direct conversations to crops or rain, but it was futile. Heard Sam Carter's youngest came home white as a sheet last night, someone would say. Says he saw a lantern moving inside the mill, the light just bobbing there, no hand steadying it. The others listened, then glanced away, measuring how close their own homes were to the mill. One voice, however, always broke through the muttering hush at such tales. Harriet Bell, widow of a sawmill worker, had little patience for half-truths. Sitting near the counter, mending shirts for her 3 boys, she would say, "You see shadows when you go looking for them. Maybe what folks need is more courage and less talk." Her eyes, sharp and gray, missed very little. Yet even she secured her shutters twice every night and muttered a prayer before bed. That morning, Pastor Wilkes strolled into the store, the Bible under his arm marked with scraps of parchment. He greeted Mr. Haggerty, then paused near the flour sacks. "The Lord sees our hearts, but the devil finds work in our fears," he said, his voice carrying further than he intended. "We must trust one another." But the pastor's words could not erase what lived in memory. Tucked away in kitchens and parlors, some families kept diaries, a habit from ancestors who'd crossed the Appalachians decades before. These journals, brittle with age, recorded the same refrain across generations. Odd sounds, livestock gone before morning, the coldness that sometimes crept up from the mill's foundation in the dead of winter. One account, written with a trembling hand in 1878, read, "Heard voices tonight. No one outside. Mill groaned and rocked as if alive. Children will not sleep. Abigail asks for her mama. I fear the sins of this place outlive their makers." Another passage, penned by a mother whose name history forgot, simply stated, "We live in a house that remembers." This kind of folklore did not disappear. If anything, it grew stronger, woven into lullabies and warnings, shaping the very rules by which children learn the world. Never take a shortcut through the trees behind the mill. Never stay out after the bell's last toll at the church. Never answer a whisper in the dark, even if it sounds like someone you know. The blood mill's hold on the county was not limited to fear. It affected daily choices, where houses were built, where livestock was pastured, which roads were traveled most often. When a local schoolteacher, Miss Dawson, arrived from Little Rock, she asked why the old creek road was never used. The answer came not from a school board, but from her students, who drew ominous shapes in the dirt and spoke of nights when the wind carried voices never meant for human ears. In one lesson, Thomas Bell, a quiet boy with hair the color of wheat, asked, "Miss Dawson, why do some souls never rest?" The question hung in the air, its weight heavier than textbooks and spelling lists. Miss Dawson felt the hush in the room and answered softly, "Sometimes the land keeps secrets. Sometimes people do, too." She did not press further, sensing the deep roots of the town's silence. Even celebrations felt the mill's pall. The summer picnic on the 4th of July, meant to mark hope and plenty, always ended before twilight. Baskets were packed, songs faded. Children gathered like ducklings as parents ushered them away before the lowering sun could touch the horizon behind the mill. Fireflies danced in the twilight, but there were no fireworks. Not here, not so close to the ever-watchful shadow on the edge of town. This atmosphere of caution shaped the dreams of the young and the ambitions of the old. Ethan Carter, Sam's eldest, longed to leave White County, to see the world, to learn a trade, to never again glance over his shoulder at dusk. "One day, I'll ride the train all the way to St. Louis," he told his mother. She only looked away, already grieving a future she could not guarantee. In the tavern by the crossroads, men spoke of leaving, but few ever did. Roots ran deep in Arkansas soil, debts and obligations even deeper. As the evening brought another wave of humid air, the talk turned, inevitably, back to the mill. Why hadn't it been torn down? Why did the sheriff refuse to enter the place even during daylight? Someone mentioned the war, that the land beneath the mill was marked by old blood, Confederate dead, or maybe something older. Another dismissed it. Fear's as good as chains when it comes to keeping people in their place. Yet curiosity, once planted, is as stubborn as dandelions. That evening, while the town settled into uneasy rest, a trio of boys made a pact. They would approach the mill after dark, just close enough to prove their bravery. It was impossible to ignore the dare, the siren call of something forbidden and mysterious. They met at the edge of the cotton field, eyes glittering with fear and promise. Reed, the ringleader, held a borrowed lantern. His hands trembled only when no one was watching. They set off, steps muffled by the soft loam, hearts pounding in their throats. The path curved beneath hanging limbs, the woods growing quieter with each pace. No bird sang. The only sound was the thump of boots against earth and the faint rattle of the lantern's glass. Near the mill, the air cooled in a way that was unnatural, dense, almost hard to breathe. From the road, the mill looked more enormous than ever. Its black maw of an entrance gaped open, daring them to come closer. Reed stepped forward, lantern aloft, his voice barely a whisper. See? Nothing but an old building. Yet his certainty wavered when the trees behind them rustled, like something passing unseen from one shadow to the next. The boys froze, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Something watched, or so it seemed, waiting patiently just beyond the lantern's narrow beam. Reed's heart beat faster. A floorboard cracked inside, a small sound, but enough to send all three sprinting back toward the lights of home, shame and excitement warring on their faces. Later, none would admit what they'd seen, or if they'd seen anything at all. But from that night forward, they understood what the grown-ups meant when they spoke of boundaries. Some were built not of fences, but of fear passed down like an heirloom. As midnight settled over White County and the mill sank once more into silence, only the wind moved. Night had claimed the fields and homes, and the boundaries set by the past kept holding strong, for now. But change was coming, even if no one yet realized it. The dare had awakened something, not in the mill, but in those who lived in its shadow. Possibility and terror, always just beneath the surface, were beginning to stir. By dawn, the bravado of the previous night had faded into something the boys wore like a hidden bruise. Reed, Thomas, and Jacob avoided each other's gaze at church that Sunday morning. The assembled congregation pressed close on the pews, the scent of soap and baking bread mixing beneath the high, echoing ceiling. Anxious mothers exchanged looks as they noticed the boys' pale faces and restless movements. Fathers kept their hands on sons' shoulders a little longer than usual, silently reinforcing boundaries that words alone never quite secured. Pastor Wilkes adjusted his collar and preached on temptation. How desire has a way of leading the unguarded toward the edge of the unknown. His voice, usually soothing, sounded urgent under the flickering gas lamps. We must recognize the call of sin, he warned, and the comfort of the path already trod. The congregation nodded, eyes glancing toward the windows as if in search of reassurance from the familiar sunlit fields. But everyone knew the message reached deeper than mere Sunday caution. In White County, sermons always danced around the real source of fear. After the service, families lingered on the church lawn. Reed's mother, Sarah, bent to whisper, "Were you near the mill last night?" Her hand squeezed his arm just a little too tightly, her own voice trembling. Reed looked away, guilt swirling with confusion. He wanted desperately to tell her everything, how the darkness had pressed in so close, how a sense of unseen eyes had frozen him on the spot, how some part of him still burned with a need to know what lay hidden in those rotting halls. But he only shrugged, promising quietly, "I was with Thomas and Jacob." The lie lingered between them, unspoken, like a prayer lost to empty rafters. Back at home, Reed tried to focus on chores, the daily litany of wood to stack and animals to tend. But each creak of the barn, each sweep of the wind through the leaves, seemed to echo what he'd heard the night before by the mill. The groan of ancient timbers, an uneven rhythm of something shuffling where no one should walk. Alone in the smokehouse, he pressed his forehead against rough boards and breathed in the smell of salt and dried meat, holding tight to a world that felt normal and solid. Still, his mind wandered back and back, as if some tether kept him anchored to that forbidden place. In the center of town, Mr. Haggerty's store became a crossroads for rumor and consolation. Jacob's father barged in before noon, his voice tight. "Saw the boys near the fields last night. They nearly trampled the radishes on their way home." He tried for humor but failed. His worry was too fresh. Mr. Haggerty offered a kind word, passing along a cup of strong coffee, but his eyes kept straying to the shadows outside the store's slatted windows. Stories layered over each other, animals gone missing, gardens disturbed, fences inexplicably broken. Somehow, everything returned to the mill, as if even the smallest misfortune clung to its orbit. Miss Dawson, the schoolteacher, walked by with her basket. She saw the cluster of worried parents and called out softly, "Let them be children." Her voice was gentle, but the words had little comfort. In a place where the past was never safely buried, even childhood innocence absorbed a charge of dread. That afternoon, Thomas Bell retreated to his family's barn, finding refuge among bales of straw and tools hung with care. He took out the pocket journal his father had given him, a place to record figures and stories. Only now, it became a way to mark what couldn't be spoken. His entry was shaky, heard footsteps. Not ours. Cold, like behind the church in winter. Wanted to run. Didn't look back. He snapped the journal shut and tucked it deep inside a feed sack, determined to hide it from his mother, from everyone. Jacob was less careful. He complained of nightmares at dinner, eyes glassy and far away. His father barked, "Enough of that talk," and Jacob fell silent, fork moving listlessly across his plate. The silence in the house thickened as darkness approached, heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. Meanwhile, Harriet Bell continued her careful watch over the younger boys, shooing them back from windows as dusk bled across the sky. She lit an extra lamp that evening, letting its warm glow pierce the corners of their small kitchen. "We'll sing tonight," she declared, leading them in old folk tunes that carried through the walls like a promise. Each note was a shield, delicate but real, against whatever might move outside. But there were others who did not seek safety in song or silence. 3 farmhands, emboldened by whiskey and a warm night, laughed off the rumors and boasted loudly at the tavern. "Only what we bring with us can hurt us," insisted Bill Hollis, pounding the table with his fist. The others nodded, raising glasses in defiance, not just of the stories, but of their own restless fears. They swore they'd spend a night in the mill itself, calling each other cowards if anyone flinched. "We'll come back with proof. Some broken-down tools, a piece of timber, anything to show our wives it's just another building." Their laughter lingered uneasily as they kicked open the tavern's swinging doors and strode out into the twilight. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small towns. By the time the moon rose above the pines, half the county buzzed with anticipation for the men's return. Some waited with brewing pride, eager for their skepticism to be rewarded. Others prayed silently by shuttered windows, unnerved by the foolhardiness of challenging old ghosts. Inside the mill, the darkness was absolute. Floorboards groaned underfoot, their patterns of decay invisible in the blackness. The farmhands pressed deeper, lamp sputtering. Spiderwebs brushed their faces and cold air curled around their ankles, rising from broken stone beneath sagging beams. The men called out jokes and taunts at first, but their voices fell flat, swallowed by the silence. Near the back wall they paused, listening. Was that a sigh or mere wind? Was that movement in the rafters or just their own nervous imaginations climbing to fever pitch? When they emerged near dawn, their faces were drawn and pale. They said only that it was nothing, spat in the dirt, and stumbled back toward the road. Yet they never entered the mill again. Their laughter at the tavern grew quieter in the weeks that followed, and they found new reasons not to pass near the old building, not even in broad daylight. They would not speak of what they'd seen or hadn't seen inside those walls. Summer wore on. The corn grew tall, and the river ran thick and slow. Life persisted in its stubborn, determined cycles, as the townsfolk tried again and again to box their fears into rituals. Prayers, chores, curfews, gentle lies told to children. But in every gesture and every word, the presence of the blood mill pulsed, a silent partner in the lives of everyone who called White County home. Beneath that stillness, the boundaries were shifting. The boys who once trembled in the shadow of the mill now felt something new, the first stirrings of defiance, the fragile hope that understanding the past might lead to freedom from its grip. In the older ones, a silent resolve was building, a wish to confront what previous generations had buried, to see for themselves the truth lurking in darkness. The mill watched, patient as always, its secrets held close. But in the hearts of White County's youth, the silence was beginning, however tentatively, to break. The days that followed carried a simmering energy, as if the entire county were waiting for a storm that never quite came. Chores and harvests filled each hour, but memories of the farmhands' hushed return from the mill sharpened the sense of something unresolved. Adults tried to carry on, grim determination masking the anxieties that crept in as shadows lengthened. Yet beneath the steady rhythms of plowing, mending, and Sunday worship, a restlessness swelled, a growing desire to learn what truth, if any, lay behind the mill's reputation. Ethan Carter felt this most acutely. Now 16, he was old enough to help with the heaviest loads, but young enough for curiosity to outweigh caution. His father's warnings had failed to quiet the questions that gnawed at him. Each morning before sunrise, as he led the mule team past the distant outline of the mill, he caught himself staring at its warped silhouette and wondered about secrets left behind by men who'd once worked those creaking floors. He began asking questions, quiet ones, saved for moments when his father's guard dropped. Why did so many families leave years ago? Did anyone ever find out who started the stories? But Samuel Carter had grown skilled at sidestepping, his answers tight and brief. Change comes. Folks move on. It's just the way of things, Ethan. Don't stir what's best left sleeping. His voice was not unkind, but it ended all conversations. It was at the schoolhouse that Ethan found a kindred spirit in Sarah Dawson. She was the youngest teacher the town had seen, her upbringing in the city a curiosity to the children, and her willingness to listen set her apart from the stern instructors of the past. In the lull between lessons, Ethan approached her with his questions, not just about arithmetic or literature, but about history, legends, and truth. Miss Dawson understood what he sought, sensing in him the same hunger that had driven her across miles to this quiet place. She'd felt the undercurrents the moment she'd arrived, the glances, the hush, the careful avoidance of certain names and stories. One hot afternoon, as dust and cicadas filled the air, she pulled a battered volume from the shelf and placed it before Ethan. This town's history isn't all in books, but sometimes reading between the lines helps, she offered. Ask old Mrs. Langley about the mill. She's seen more seasons than most, she remembers. Mrs. Langley's cottage, perched near the woods, its garden wild with sunflowers and mint. She welcomed Ethan with sharp wit and keen eyes, her hands perpetually busy with embroidery. At first, she brushed aside his questions about the mill. Why waste breath on the past, boy? There's living to be done. But something about his persistence softened her. On his third visit, she relented and spoke, her voice a careful mix of warning and weary resignation. They were good men, some of them. But the mill changed folks. Hard work, long hours, too many debts, too little hope. Fights broke out, sometimes worse. There was a fire once, and a young girl lost her life. That was the first real tragedy, the kind the land itself seems to remember. After that, well, people started leaving. Some said they heard her crying, late at night. Others said it was the wind. But the pain stuck like burrs on a hound. Ethan listened, troubled but emboldened. Do you think what happened there is really gone? He pressed. Mrs. Langley shook her head, silver hair shining in the sun. Pain like that settles in deep, Ethan. It takes its time moving on. The land remembers. So do we. She patted his hand, her eyes misting. Don't let curiosity carry you away, boy. The living have enough burdens. Ethan thanked her, but the old warnings did little to soothe the new questions her stories provoked. If the mill's darkness sprang from wounds and sorrow, not otherworldly evil, perhaps truth and remembrance could be tools for healing. That night, as thunder rolled gently on the horizon, Ethan made a promise to himself that he would return to the mill, not under cover of childish dares, but with purpose, a light to chase out the old shadows. Meanwhile, the rest of the town was growing restless in more subtle ways. Reed found comfort in the company of his friends, but his demeanor had changed. A seriousness had rooted itself in his posture and speech. Thomas tried harder than ever to please his parents, responding quickly to every chore, as if salvation lay in routine. Jacob, though, withdrew, nights troubled by dreams he refused to recount. Each boy, in his own fashion, was forever marked by their brush against the unknown. In the grown-ups, unease bred argument. Neighbors who once leaned on each other now bickered over property lines and borrowed tools. Patience thinned. Tempers flared. Even Pastor Wilkes's sermons, once gentle, became sharper, urging forgiveness and unity while betraying his own exhaustion. At dinner tables and across garden fences, the same question persisted. Had the mill's curse changed, or had the town brought it upon itself by refusing to confront old wounds? As the week edged towards Saturday, market day, the closest thing to celebration White County ever saw, rumors brewed like summer thunder. Some claimed to have glimpsed figures wandering between the mill and the woods during the night. Others insisted they heard sobbing, carried across distant fields at sunset. These visions were rarely challenged. Even the skeptics had started locking their doors before dusk without quite knowing why. It was during one of these afternoons, with the sun spilling gold across the dusty road, that Sarah Dawson, her curiosity unchecked by local caution, walked deliberately toward the mill. She stopped just short of the porch, heart thudding in her chest. The silence there was profound, the air tinged with old smoke and moss. She studied the scorched timbers, the rusted gears visible through a gaping wall. Nothing moved, yet the sense of memory pressed against her until she shivered. When at last she turned back, she found Ethan in the lane, watching anxiously. She smiled with a mixture of defiance and fear. It stands stubborn as grief. Maybe it's time someone listened. Word of her visit spread, sparking new arguments. Was she brave or foolish? Some worried her actions would stir whatever slept in those walls. Others admired the courage to confront what so many avoided. For Ethan, it was the sign he'd been waiting for. If change was possible, it would start not with bravado, but with understanding. That night, before the town settled into silence, Ethan knocked softly at Sarah's door. "Tomorrow morning," he whispered. "First light." She nodded, her resolve twinned with his. The promise was made. The waiting was almost over. As dawn crept in from the east, two figures approached the mill together, neither running nor hiding. They brought nothing but a lantern and their resolve. White County itself seemed to hold its breath as their footsteps echoed on the porch, a sound quiet but unyielding, like hope. The silence was breaking, and the past, at long last, would be faced. Ethan and Sarah approached the blood mill, just as the first sunlight painted the Arkansas sky in streaks of pink and gold. The world was hushed, dew beating on tall blades of grass, the field silent except for a distant rooster and the muffled trill of early birds. The old porch groaned under their boots, the sound loud in the morning stillness. Neither spoke for several moments. The weight of their intention, unmasked and purposeful, filled the air between them. Ethan raised the lantern, its glow fragile against the mill's bulk. The wooden doors hung crooked, swinging slightly as the wind sighed through broken panes. Inside, dust hovered in fat motes, drifting in and out of sunlight. Gears and pulleys lay rusted, battered sacks, and bits of chain scattered across the warped boards. The place smelled of mold, oiled metal, and something older, a sweetness tinged with rot. Sarah broke the silence. "No more stories. Let's look for what's real." Her voice was soft, but steady. She led the way, stepping carefully to avoid loose planks. Ethan followed, lantern high, illuminating corners which melted away into darkness. Their footsteps echoed. They found old crates, dry cobs, tattered pieces of cloth, and ledgers with ink faded to nothing. Sarah thumbed through one book, its pages stiff. Names. Debt tallies. Lists of harvests, she read aloud. The words were mundane, but the margins revealed another truth. Scrawled notations of men who left, who owed too much, who died before the end of the season. Here, the mill told its story without malice, just the slow, steady erosion of lives worn thin by work and want. Ethan knelt by the largest machine, tracing a groove in the iron. "My uncle worked here," he murmured. "Pa said it gave him a cough that never left." Sarah glanced at him, feeling the old ache settle in her chest. No ghosts, just memories and the harm we forget to name. As they explored, both felt the shadows differently. The dread that once kept children away gave way to sadness, wide and deep. Near the back, they found the burnt section, blackened beams, shattered glass underfoot. It was here Mrs. Langley had said the fire took lives. And here Ethan bent down, touching the scorched floor with reverence. So much pain, and not just stories chasing the wind. They sat together, letting the silence fill the space. Sarah whispered, "If all these secrets stay hidden, we'll keep turning away from each other forever." The words trembled between them, an admission, a challenge, a hope. Beyond the mill, the sun rose higher. Reed, Thomas, and Jacob had gathered at the edge of the field, their anxiety knitting them together. Reed, carrying his own lantern, watched Ethan and Sarah's forms through the milky glass. The other boys stood silent, torn between fear and kinship. Slowly, Ethan stepped outside and nodded, beckoning them forward. "We found nothing but truth." "Come see," Ethan said. Reed hesitated, then crossed the yard. Inside, the three followed the path Ethan and Sarah had taken, past the ledger, the bent chain, the place where blackened boards marked old grief. Thomas, wide-eyed, traced the soot with his small hands. "It feels cold, but maybe it's not haunted. Maybe it's just sad." Sarah nodded. "Places remember. That's all. If we forget to forgive old wounds, the pain stays." Word spread quickly through White County. By midday, several adults arrived, summoned not by gossip, but by their children's determination. Sam Carter, stern but humbled, entered the mill for the first time since his brother's death. Harriet Bell watched her youngest stand quietly in the burnt section, a look of peace replacing the fear she'd seen for so many nights. Gradually, a hush settled. The mill was no longer a monster lurking at the edge of town. It was a place of sorrow, yes, but sorrow that belonged to everyone, that could now be named and mourned. Pastor Wilkes arrived, Bible tucked beneath one arm, and kneeled amidst the dust. He spoke a brief prayer, steady and kindly, asking peace for those who suffered and wisdom for those who remained. For the rest of the week, the mill became an unexpected gathering space. Neighbors brought dishes to share, stories to unburden. Old wounds found air and attention. No longer was darkness the best shield. Daylight brought the courage to face what was buried. Some tried to mend what could be repaired, straightened boards, replaced windows, swept the floors. Others simply sat together, talking into the long evening. Laughter began to echo in the rafters, and once or twice, music drifted up from a harmonica as sunset pooled behind the old roof. The oldest among them, Mrs. Langley, placed a bouquet of sunflowers by the burnt beam, a gesture of remembrance, her way of saying goodbye to the pain that lingered. Sarah and Ethan watched and felt a quiet sense of hope. In homes that night, parents thanked their children for their courage. Dread subsided, but respect remained, a new kind of boundary, one built not on fear but acknowledgement. The mill no longer held power through secrecy. It gave up its ghosts and became, simply, part of the landscape. As twilight fell over White County, Ethan stood outside the mill with Sarah, watching lanterns flicker in the growing dusk. He remembered what Mrs. Langley had said, "Pain like that settles in deep." And he realized together they had begun to lift something heavy, not for themselves alone, but for all those who would call this place home. The blood mill's legacy changed, its story retold not as a warning, but as an invitation to bear witness, to forgive, and to root new strength in the soil where sorrow once thrived. The mill's transformation resonated across White County, but relief was not universal. In some hearts, release from fear felt unfamiliar, like stepping onto a road with no clear direction. For days, the town hovered in a tentative peace, neighbors testing the boundaries of their new openness. At supper tables, the talk lingered on forgiveness and unfinished grievances, the mill now a symbol for all wounds that had yet to close. But the storm that had threatened for weeks finally broke. The sky darkened in the middle of a sweltering afternoon. Breezes whipped the long grass into restless waves, and thunder rolled over the fields. As rain pounded tin roofs, families huddled indoors, remembering lesser floods, and hoping the new sense of unity would not dissolve under the first challenge. The blood mill, repaired and repurposed, became a temporary refuge for livestock as the creek overflowed and roads turned to mud. Inside the mill, Sarah and Ethan organized neighbors to shore up weakened beams and spread hay for the displaced cattle. The old building groaned in the wind, but its walls held. Lanterns flickered on makeshift tables, casting long shadows against newly cleaned floors. Reed gathered the smaller children, whispering stories that had nothing to do with ghosts, but everything to do with hope and staying brave together. When the storm's fury peaked, Harriet Bell volunteered her bread and blankets, moving quickly through the crowded room. Thomas offered his harmonica, filling anxious moments with soothing melodies. Even Pastor Wilkes stepped up, leading everyone in a prayer not of protection from evil, but of thanks for the strength to endure. The mill, once feared, was now a source of comfort and resilience. Pain had been acknowledged, and in its place a new solidarity formed. Outside, lightning split the sky, an epic drama mirrored by the smaller struggles waged indoors. Children whimpered, parents fretted over battered fence lines, and the Carter mule refused food. Ethan's father worked shoulder to shoulder with Mrs. Langley, both of them intent on reinforcing the south wall before the next wave of wind struck. Their hands, rough from years of labor, moved with purpose. This time, no one was alone. As night descended and rain softened to a drizzle, the mill began to hum with small acts of kindness. Dishes were washed and shared, wounded animals nursed, frayed tempers soothed by a neighbor's patience. Stories filled the space, a blend of old memories and new dreams. Jacob, the youngest among the boys, recounted days spent fishing with a grandfather now gone, weaving memory with hope. Yet, for a handful who stood closest to the mill's secrets, the storm brought another kind of reckoning. Sarah knew her time in White County was nearing its end. The city awaited, with lessons to teach and new children to guide. She watched each gesture, the way Ethan led without command, how Mrs. Langley smiled in the lamplight, the quieter resolve in Reed's eyes, and understood that stories, when owned and shared, could change more than a building. They could rebuild trust fractured by years of silence. It was Ethan, now taller and steadier, who voiced what others could not. As neighbors prepared for sleep, he spoke on the mill porch, lantern raised so all could see. "We built our fears here," he said gently, "but we found our courage too. Let's not forget. Let's remember every part, loss and hope, sorrow and strength. This place is ours now." His words were met with nods and quiet gratitude. The mill itself seemed to breathe easier, freed from the prison of old secrets. Rain tapered and stars emerged, little by little, through ragged cloud patches. The first rays of dawn revealed a town changed, not by a miracle, but by resolve. The blood mill was no longer feared, nor left to fester. It had become a home for memory and for living. People saw themselves reflected in its battered walls, not as victims, but as survivors. Forgiveness, slow and imperfect, moved through the yards and fields. The storm had tested their bond and found it stronger than expected. As White County readied for the next day, something quiet but vital had shifted. Generations would come to know the story not through warnings whispered at sundown, but spoken openly and with compassion. The mill, and all it symbolized, belonged to the living. With blue skies returning, the land around the mill shimmered with new possibility. White County's routines resumed, but subtle changes marked each day. The mill, once the axis of unspoken grief, now hosted moments of laughter and honest conversation. Its walls, scrubbed by rain and softened by shared memory, lost some of their former menace, becoming instead a reminder of the power found in facing what once was feared. Ethan took on more responsibility, helping neighbors with repairs as the fields dried. His voice held a quiet conviction, shaped by what he'd lived and learned inside those shadowed walls. Other boys and girls, once drawn only by curiosity or bravado, now wandered by the mill freely, sometimes pausing to run their hands along sun-warmed wood, feeling pride rather than dread. Sarah kept a watchful presence during her last days in White County. She gathered a small group, Ethan, Reed, Thomas, and even Jacob, and invited them to write their own accounts of the mill. In the shade of an old persimmon tree, they put pen to paper, not to record only the pain, but to capture every piece of the journey, from fear to understanding. Their words formed a new legend, a communal story, owned by everyone, meant to be passed along not as a warning, but as a testament of what truth could do. Pastor Wilkes read their accounts aloud at the end of summer service, his voice strong where it might once have trembled. May we always remember the cost of silence and the gift of forgiveness, he intoned. Let no wound, old or new, flourish in the dark. The congregation listened with reverence, recognizing their own struggles and hopes reflected in the story woven by their children. Harriet Bell, usually so reserved, found herself laughing more freely with her neighbors. She told Sarah, "I kept my boys from this place, thinking I could shield them from hurt. Maybe all I did was hide them from healing." Sarah squeezed her hand. Together, they looked across the fields, where the mill now stood as a beacon rather than a threat. Time, slow but sure, knit these transformations into the daily fabric of White County. Sunday suppers lingered longer. Gardens were tended in the company of friends. And for the first time in decades, the new school year included a field trip to the old mill. There, amid beams still blackened by long-ago fire, students learned not to shun the past, but to embrace its lessons. Ethan, now recognized for his quiet leadership, joined Miss Dawson for tea on her last evening. They spoke of futures, his uncertain but wide open, hers threaded with both sadness and hope for the children she left behind. "Promise me," she said as night fell. "Promise you'll keep building truth here." He nodded, feeling the weight of inheritance and the gift of trust. On her final morning, Sarah walked once more to the mill, Ethan and several townsfolk at her side. As the sun rose, she pressed a slip of paper, her own account, between the pages of the recovered ledger. "Let's remember, so we don't repeat," she said. "Forgiveness is work, but it's worth it." The crowd stood quiet for several moments, absorbing her words, the air thick with gratitude and the fresh possibility of all that forgiveness might yield. Some cried, others only smiled, lost in personal reckonings. Even the oldest doubters felt their burdens lighten. As the day wore on and Sarah's train chugged out of White County, the people she left behind found their routines transformed. Fear no longer ruled sundown. Stories no longer whispered. The field, the river, and especially the old mill had become a map of trials endured and wounds at last given names. Ethan watched the sun slip behind the mill's repaired roof, knowing the story had changed him, changed them all. White County's silence had been broken, and in its place, threads of forgiveness bound together something sturdier than any superstition. A community, reborn by its willingness to forgive and remember. The heat of late summer pressed down on White County with new purpose, as if nature itself sensed the shift in spirit. The old routines resumed. Farmers waking before dawn, children trailing barefoot through dewy grass, merchants opening shutters to let in heavy light. Yet the mill, once a silent boundary dividing past and present, had become a silent witness to all that now unfolded. Its presence, both gentle and formidable, had settled into the landscape like a stone in a river, no longer a source of fear, but of strength. Days after Sarah's departure marked a turning point for Ethan Carter. With Sarah gone, the story of the blood mill belonged to him, and those who remained. The responsibility was heavy, yet filled with hope. Ethan woke earlier than ever, mind whirring with ideas, repair projects to finish, accounts to organize, gardens to tend, promises to uphold. His father noticed a change, offering him the family's ledger, a book once reserved for debts, now destined to hold new futures. The town, united with cautious optimism, gathered for the annual harvest, an event both celebration and adjudication, where fields were weighed and hard decisions made. This year, the gathering would be held at the mill for the first time in living memory. It was a statement, clear and necessary. Their history would no longer be shut away or left unspoken. Ethan stood beside the old timber entrance as farmers, their families, and curious onlookers arrived, arms loaded with apples, corn, quilts, and patchwork baskets. The crowd was larger than ever before. Inside the mill, Harriet Bell organized the food with practiced efficiency, her boys helping beside her. Reed set up benches so neighbors could rest. Thomas and Jacob prepared spaces for games and music, transforming the once haunted hall into a place of joy. The laughter of children ricocheted off the planks, blending with the smells of pie and roasting meat. The mill's vastness lost its echo, filled instead with a chorus of living voices. Ethan made rounds, greeting each guest, sharing stories both old and new. He listened carefully, aware that among the lightness, deeper reckonings lingered. Many families, for all their smiles, still carried pains born not in the mill, but in years of hardship, disputes over land, secrets unshared, mistakes unatoned. He resolved to address these openly, believing forgiveness would come not only through facing the mill's past, but by healing what hobbled the community today. As dusk approached, Ethan climbed atop a sturdy barrel and called for silence. The hum of conversation faded. "We gather here, as our parents and grandparents once feared to do," he began, voice steady and clear. "This mill witnessed great sorrow, but no more than any of us have known in our own hearts. What we do today is not just celebration, it is reckoning. Let us speak, let us remember, let us forgive." At first, silence pressed back. But then Harriet Bell, after a heart-stopping pause, cleared her throat. "When my husband died, I blamed many people. Some who deserve it, most who didn't. I held that weight for years. Today, I leave it here. This old building carried enough sorrow. I won't add more." Her words cut through the crowd. Tears shone on faces old and young. Others stepped forward. Mr. Haggerty, the storekeeper, confessed a long-held grudge against the neighboring farmer for a fence never mended and a debt never paid. With shaky hands, he forgave. The men embraced, laughter splintering the tension. Even Pastor Wilkes owned up to moments in which his faith had faltered, promising to walk beside neighbors whose burdens he dismissed. One by one, people released their wounds into the open air. Disputes were settled, apologies rendered, new vows spoken. Children watched with rapt attention, learning another lesson, one not of rumor or fear, but of humility. This outpouring of honesty did not come without struggle. Some found forgiveness easy, others choked on words or abandoned attempts entirely, choosing silence for now. Ethan respected them, knowing healing often lagged behind the first brave step. He understood, as Sarah had taught, that time and intention would do their slow work. As twilight bloomed, music rose, a mix of fiddle and harmonica, voices layered in song. Harriet's sons led a round of old folk tunes, and the crowd joined in, the mill's rafters amplifying every note. A bonfire was lit outside, flames painting faces with unlikely warmth. Friends and strangers mingled, stories replaced rumors, and the spirit of the harvest took hold. Laughter twined together with tears. A new tradition was born. In the glow, Ethan found himself beside Mrs. Langley. The elderly woman watched the dancing children, her hands folded in her lap. "I always hoped for a day like this. Our secrets don't have to be chains," she murmured. Ethan knelt beside her and asked, "Do you forgive the mill, Mrs. Langley?" She smiled, her eyes moist with memory. "The mill was never the enemy, Ethan. Fear was. Today we choose something else." Midnight crept close, but few wanted to leave. The mill, now buzzing with hope, seemed to shelter its guests as family, not captives. Stories and laughter pierced through the last chains of secrecy. Some guests lingered outside, sharing memories under a ceiling of stars. Others walked the newly mended halls, finding peace in the rhythm of passing footsteps. At the edge of the bonfire's light, Reed gathered Ethan, Thomas, and Jacob. They spoke quietly, voices barely audible over the music. "It's different now," Reed commented, coloring his words. "Like something heavy finally moved." Thomas added, "I think we're part of something bigger, not just fixing an old mill, but fixing all the things that went wrong before." Jacob nodded. "My nightmare stopped 2 days ago. It's like the fear left when Sarah did." Ethan looked out at the faces illuminated by firelight. He felt the magnitude of forgiveness and the subtle threat of its absence. "What happened here is only a beginning," he said, voice tempered and wise. "We'll keep remembering, keep forgiving. That's how we stay strong." As fatigue drew the night to a close, the guests departed in pairs and small groups, the valley echoing with a collection of hopeful farewells. The Carter family paused inside the mill before heading home, Ethan's father squeezing his son's shoulder with pride and gratitude. Harriet walked her boys along the moonlit path, promising they would return next year. Mrs. Langley, supported by Pastor Wilkes, left a final gift, a hand-carved stone at the mill door, marked with a single word, hope. Ethan remained. He walked the mill's halls, lantern soft in his hand. He recalled Sarah's lessons, that history must be faced, wounds named, forgiveness extended. He vowed, as the last embers smoldered on the breeze, that every story whispered in fear would be spoken aloud, that every wound could mend. The dawn that followed was like no other. White County awoke to the aftermath of honest reckoning. Fields glimmered with promise. Faces reflected relief. The mill, once a monument to secrets, had given rise to a community made whole by its courage to forgive. Now, as the harvest season waned and autumn prepared its turn, Ethan and his friends looked ahead. Their burden was shared, their pain named and soothed. White County was a place not just of history, but of healing, a living testament to what memory and forgiveness could achieve. Autumn settled in over White County with gentle authority, golden leaves spinning in slow circles across fields and riverbanks. The energy of the harvest festival lingered, like a fresh breeze in every conversation, carrying memories of unity and new beginnings. The mill had become central in daily life, not as a dark legend, but as living proof of what a community can endure and transform. Ethan, now a figure of quiet respect, settled into his role as caretaker and historian. He rose early to sweep leaves from the mill steps, joined many mornings by Harriet Bell and her boys. Harriet, always practical, had organized a weekly breakfast in the mill, open to anyone who wished to share food or stories. Neighbors arrived with casseroles and jam, old family recipes, each dish carrying some imprint of the mill's history, transformed from burden to celebration. Work shifted with the season. Reed, Thomas, and Jacob helped Ethan repair the old fence behind the mill, their laughter and arguments blending easily with the crunch of branches beneath their boots. Some days, they paused to reflect on how much had changed, how silence had been replaced, how they no longer felt the urge to prove bravery through dares and risk, but through honesty and kindness. At school, Miss Dawson's absence lingered, her influence felt in the new teacher's gentler approach and in lessons layered with local stories. The children's written accounts of the mill were stored in the schoolhouse with pride, a testament to the power of truth and reconciliation. Mrs. Langley visited often, reading the stories aloud to younger students, each word stitching another thread of strength into the county's foundation. The adults, too, found renewal in old relationships. Mr. Haggerty and his neighbor, once estranged over forgotten debts, partnered to stage a small autumn market in the mill's yard. Fresh apples, pickled onions, hand-woven baskets, and carved wood-filled makeshift stalls. Harriet coordinated music, her boys and their friends playing harmonica and banjo on an impromptu stage. The crowd clapped along, smiling easily in the day's warm glow. Pastor Wilkes drew from the mill's transformation in his sermons, guiding his listeners through reflections about memory, responsibility, and forgiveness. The strongest roots are grown in rocky soil, he said one bright Sunday, standing at the mill's entrance with his hat in his hands. What we nurture now will feed us and those after us. The old wounds may be healed, but the lessons remain. Let the mill always remind us, not just of fear, but of forgiveness and the strength in honesty. As leaves gathered and the wind grew sharper, the mill entered its own season of renewal. Community meetings often took place in its main hall, discussions flowing more freely than ever before. Arguments were settled with patience, not pride. Apologies were given without expectation of shame or retribution. Even those who held out against forgiveness began, little by little, to let go, sometimes in awkward conversation, sometimes in silent tears beside an open window. For Ethan, the sense of legacy deepened. He began compiling an account of the mill's history, drawing from diaries, stories, confessions, and the new records offered by friends and elders. Together with Reed and Thomas, he mapped the mill's transformations, the places once feared, now gathering points for laughter and hope. He found joy in small victories, a repaired tool, laughter over breakfast, a handful of letters from Sarah in the city filled with pride for White County's courage. Change revealed itself in unexpected ways. Jacob, who had struggled most with nightmares, discovered new confidence, helping others with chores and listening to their stories. "I used to only think of the mill at night," he told Ethan one crisp morning. "Now I think of it whenever I see people together and happy." Fear helped no one. Forgiving did. As the first frost threatened, the town prepared for winter. The mill acted as a storehouse, neighbors pooling extra supplies: flour, salted meat, apples, wool. Harriet organized a quilt-making day, transforming scraps into patchwork blankets, which would keep families warm through the coldest part of the year. Ethan watched over every step, marking names in the ledger, proud of how the mill's painful memory had become a source of practical love. Harvest's end was marked with a quiet evening celebration around the old bonfire pit. Reed, Thomas, Jacob, and Ethan sat together, watching sparks rise into the dark sky. "There's nothing left to fear," Thomas said. "Just things to remember, and things to build." Ethan nodded, heart full but steady. "The mill won't ever be what it was. That's all right. We're different, too. Better." They sat without speaking, feeling the truth settle around them, the sense that everything they'd been through was not just a chapter, but a foundation. From old roots, new life had sprung. Neighbors lingered late, sharing quiet words and gentle laughter. Mrs. Langley pressed a new poem into Ethan's hands, words honoring grief, transformation, survival. He read it aloud to the group. "We are not the sum of what we fear, but of what we choose to tend. Through mill and memory, root and wound, we find ourselves made whole again." As night deepened and everyone parted for home, the mill stood tall beneath the moon, a beacon of renewal, proof that history's hold can be transformed by the courage to forgive and the will to change. And so, as the first snow whispered at the edges of White County, Ethan and all its families prepared for the future. The story of the blood mill was no longer a cautionary tale, but a mark of strength, woven into every routine, every bond. The roots ran deep, but now, at last, they bore the fruit of renewal. Winter draped White County in solemn white, the first snows transforming every angle and crevice into something new and hushed. The mill, once a foreboding structure lost to nightmare, now shone at the edge of each day, redefined by the warmth and humanity it sheltered. Icicles stretched from its roof, sparkling in the morning light. Neighbors traced familiar paths through the drifts, boots leaving patterns that led, almost always, to the mill doors. Ethan found peace in winter's quiet. Inside, he tended the fire for those who came to share stories, read, or simply rest in the golden glow. The interior, scented with pine and baking bread, became a sanctuary from January's bite. Reed and Thomas carved wooden toys for the youngest children. Jacob, now sure-footed and eager, took charge organizing rations and making sure no one was left behind during weekly check-ins. Seasonal hardship revealed the new strength of the community. When a blizzard stranded a nearby family, volunteers from White County carried blankets and food through waist-high snow, guiding them to the mill's safety. Each day, someone brought news, laughter, or music, weaving a tapestry of comfort stronger than fear or sorrow. Mrs. Langley, now frail but unwavering, presided over evening readings, her stories looping back not to terror, but to endurance, harvest, and the promise of spring. Letters from Sarah arrived with regularity, bringing news from the city. She had shared the tale of the blood mill in her classroom, inspiring children frightened by their own ghost to talk, write, and connect. "Your courage," she wrote, "grows farther than you know." Ethan smiled at her words, reading them aloud to anyone gathered within earshot. Pride for White County, once tinged with embarrassment and denial, shone out across miles, linking city and county, child and adult, past and future. Beneath the peace, the villagers wove silent bonds. Harriet Bell found herself mentoring younger women, teaching skills handed down through generations and new ways of mending wounds, both in cloth and in spirit. Mr. Haggerty, aged but persistent, recorded the year's lessons in a new ledger. Debts forgiven, promises made, the harvest shared. Pastor Wilkes, reflecting on the seasons, used the mill story as a parable about faith, forgiveness, and letting go. Late one evening, as wind howled beyond thick walls, Ethan brought together the small circle that, months before, had broken the mill's curse. Reed, Thomas, Jacob, and Mrs. Langley, joined by Harriet and Pastor Wilkes. Tea steamed from battered cups, and the fire snapped. Ethan cleared his throat, looking at each face in the low light. "We did more than save a building," he said quietly. "We saved each other. There isn't a person here who doesn't carry scars. But there isn't a person here who holds them alone anymore." Silence settled before Mrs. Langley spoke. Her words were thin but strong. "We honored memory. But you children taught us something we never learned. You taught us to speak aloud and to let it go." Thomas, now taller, more at ease, nodded. "We'll remember the truth, and we'll remember how to start again. When others come with pain, we'll welcome them." Outside, the wind eased. Reed, and even Jacob, laughed in gentle relief. The horror that once defined winter's edge no longer pressed into the walls, no longer echoed in dreams. It had transformed, made bearable by kindness, understanding, and ownership of the story. As the season turned, word spread about the new White County. Curious visitors arrived in spring, family from other states, travelers passing through. Instead of shunning the mill, townsfolk welcomed newcomers inside, proud to share the history, inviting them to breakfast, to listen or contribute a memory to the growing collection. The mill became a living archive, each person adding to its lore. The annual spring planting brought a new ritual. At dawn, the villagers gathered within the mill, sharing a moment of silence for the old wounds, then stepping outside, scattering seeds in the thawing ground around the building and down the valley. Each handful dropped into earth was a promise that what once rooted in fear would give way to hope, nourishment, and connection. Over time, children who'd grown up running in terror from the mill raced down the valley with laughter, their games looping in and out of the open doors. The first wildflowers of summer found a home in the cracks between the stones. The river ran clear, unburdened by night sounds or old rumors. There were other hardships, other losses, illness, crop failure, the occasional argument, but the town met each with the same resolve: truth, compassion, and unity. Ethan continued documenting all of it, page after page. He was no longer a boy peering nervously at darkness, but a man shaped by the choice to confront it. The future stretched before him, uncertain, but no longer marked by secrets or fear of the past. Some days, the ache of old wounds returned, shadows at the edge of sleep, but he met them with the same promise made on that first morning in the mill. No pain left unnamed, no history left unspoken. As another year completed its turn, the mill became a beacon beyond even White County's borders. Its story, once shrouded in small, traveled far, carried by those who had learned that forgiveness is never weakness, that memory is best held in shared hands, and that a community's strength lies not in forgetting sorrow, but in transforming it. On the mill's stone threshold, the word hope remained, worn smooth by passing feet and curious fingers. It was a mark and a bond, a reminder whispered through every generation that no secret, however horrifying, need outlive the courage to name and heal it. And so White County endured, not untouched by pain or immune to hardship, but defined by a light that never left, a willingness to gather in the darkest times and, together, shape a future worthy of remembrance. The blood mill, once feared above all else, stood, etched with memory, alive with laughter, and radiant with redemption, as proof that even the deepest wounds can yield to the quiet work of forgiveness, and that in the heart of every gathering, a new hope can always take root.
Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.